It is a brand new, a Monday edition of Flyers Daily, presented as always by Ticketmaster. Make more memories live, as we do every Monday, and through the summer, we have some great conversations. We can stretch our legs a little bit in the heat. We're through the midway point of the offseason for the Flyers, which means their last game is further away from their next game. But joining us as he does every Monday from PhiladelphiaFlyers.com, NHL.com, and HockeyBuzz.com, it is Bill Meltzer. Bill, we're on the other side. We're on the back nine, if you will, of the offseason. We're not quite to the closing holes yet, but we are further away from when the season ended to when it's going to begin on October 11th.
Yeah, I mean, truthfully, this feels like the offseason that just won't end.
Yeah.
Where, it's been. I mean, that's what happens when when you're done by the middle of April and the Stanley Cup Finals finish so late. It feels even longer, but yeah, I mean, and we're also honestly in the what's pretty much league wide, pretty much the dead part of the off season, other than teams that have arbitration cases. Flyers this year don't have any arbitration cases, so there isn't that to talk about. There haven't been moves, trade wise, so it just feels like such a long gap, but before we know it, it'll be time when we're counting down to when camp starts, the rookies camp, rookies game, preseason, roster battles, and those kind of things. It's just getting over the hump until that point.
Bill, I see a lot of the discourse on social media that this isn't a rebuild because not much has happened this offseason. And, it's been kind of anticlimactic. You go into an offseason, despite the fact that Matvei Michkov's coming over 2 years early, yes. It still feels anticlimactic because really the only other move of note is the buyout of Cam Atkinson. You look at this offseason, last week we started talking about expectations. We're going to talk about that a little bit in this episode with you. But as far as what maybe you expected this offseason and what hasn't or has not taken place, what's kind of your feeling on that expectation that you had and what has happened or pretty much not happened?
Well, we went in, at least my expectations were the Flyers to be very aggressive in seeking a hockey trade or two, potentially moving up at the draft, those kind of things. You have your usual turnover in the offseason, maybe a player signed in a 1 year prove it kind of trade or whatever the case might be, but more changeover than there's been. And these things from all indications, specifically in terms of moving up at the draft, there were discussions. They weren't able to find a deal that worked. Same thing in terms of hockey trades. Either anyone that they're interested in, the price tag has been too high, or the other way around, players that you'd be willing to move, not being able to get fair value for them, as you determine fair value to be. So, it's a little frustrating at this stage to just be essentially looking at almost, other than Atkinson departing and Michkov coming in, which are two significant things, but other than that, we're really looking at the status quo that there was at the in the last season. We talked a lot about being aggressive and the need to be aggressive. The flip side of that is that, sometimes the best moves are the ones that you don't make. That's still true.
Torrey Krug and Travis Sanheim last year.
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes
for those that don't know, real quick, Krug may be out for the entire season with, I believe, a foot injury.
Yes. Yeah, and that's a trade that certainly a year later you're happy you didn't make. And
I was happy at the time they didn't make it, Bill. I didn't like Torrey Krug for this team.
For sure. And
we talked about it. Yeah.
Yeah, and neither did I, given his contract, the way he's seems to be declining, all those kind of things, right? The one positive, at least on paper, would have been maybe the power play would have been a little better, maybe not. And if it would have been significantly better enough where you would want that contract for the rest, for the rest of his duration. So it's that's a good example of a trade you didn't make that looks better a year later for not making it. If we're talking next summer about largely standing pat, other than the drafts, with the cap increasing again, with some free agent decisions to make and those kind of things, and unless something more significant happens over the next year. Also, as we discussed also in a previous podcast, there's a decision about John Tortorella because he's entering the final year of his contract. So there's a lot of decisions. If we're talking about next year of basically running back again, with your head coach going into a lame duck season, those kind of things, that would be a huge disappointment. Right now, to me, it's more just thinking that more was going to happen than has happened.
Yeah, and I think part of it, and I get fans' frustration in this. They think rebuild, you've got to either be tearing down or rebuilding, and they're kind of doing neither this offseason. But also, I think you need to be aggressive, but not desperate. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like I think they probably listened on a guy like Joel Farabee, right? But it's easy for fans to say, just trade him, get rid of him. Get Scott Laughton, just get rid of him. Well, there's a couple things there. There's cost for replacement. Number one, there is, I know some people don't want to kind of buy into this, and in particular analytics people, because they don't see the quantitative value in culture, but culture does matter, especially when it comes to a player like Scott Laughton, and you're going to be welcoming in a player in Matvei Michkov, and I know Laughton doesn't speak fluid Belarus or Russian, but he will be a big part of that, welcoming him into the integration of the locker room despite that. So I get all of those things. And, you could make a lot of mistakes this offseason, making changes for the sake of change. But is it the best situation? I can harken back to Patrick Sharp or Justin Williams and say, yeah, they made those changes for the sake of change, but they weren't the right moves in hindsight to move on from those players.
Right. And in Justin Williams' case, obviously it's a very different situation for the Flyers now. But at that time, when in that small window frame, right, the Flyers needed another defenseman, another starter, and Danny Markov was a damn good player in those playoffs.
Yeah,
he needed a defenseman more than he needed a forward. Flyers got within one win in the Cup Finals, and it wasn't Danny Markov that cost them that, or not having Justin Williams at the time. But the problem being, then you had the lockout, right? Markov gets moved on. He's gone. So you only had him for that short period of time, and Justin Williams went on to the career that he had. And then it's getting off track to say, okay, if the Flyers did win the Cup that year, would have made it all worth it, right?
More in the vein of Neuendijk for Iginla.
Right. Exactly. In the short term, for sure. In the long term, no. And then you go, well, we didn't win the Cup. We didn't get to the finals. We lost a 2-1 Game 7. So it looks terrible, but in terms of, you go back years later, boy, having Justin Williams for some of those subsequent near miss runs, like 2008 getting to the conference final, 2010, he sure would have helped. And once, especially when you're talking about homegrown players you're developing. I mean, Farabee would be an example of a guy still young, he came into the league so young at 19, a year after 1 year in college hockey. So he feels older than he actually is. A young player who's had a couple 20-goal seasons already. Whatever. Should every reason to think he could still get better. Well, if you're going to make that move, you stick to your guns on price. Not just for that player, but for going forward, where if other teams know they'll just wear you down by waiting you out, you'll never get fair value on the player. Yeah. Teams will forever be undercutting you. And I think it's still in the phase where teams are testing out Danny Briere to see if he's somebody that can wear down, someone who would make a trade that's short-sighted or whatever. So it's there's a long game there too that you're working towards. It's sitting and looking where they are right now this offseason again, and it's not what a lot of us had hoped for, but I think that I would say stay patient a bit longer, see what happens over the next year, and by all means see how see how some of these young players they've drafted in recent years come along, because that's still the biggest piece of a rebuild, is the guys you draft and you develop.
Yeah, as they take steps, for sure.
Yeah.
Bill, how much different would it be, our impression of Joel Farabee, if we flipped this season around? If he got off to the slow start that he finished with, and he finished with the fast start that he started with. I think our impression of Joel Farabee would be far different going into this offseason, and that's just the reality of it.
Yeah, and it's funny in that way, in that early impressions in a season tend to form opinions for months thereafter. You have a fast start, and even in broadcast, he's off to a great start. He's having a great year, and he's actually had 2 quiet months. Say it's December and January. It wasn't really till well after the All-Star break that there were people were saying, it's kind of dried up for Joel a little bit. He's been struggling for a while, or at least struggling to score. But after the season, when you look at the season as a whole, the player gets hot, and there's the recency bias of it. So if a player finishes the season strong, there's a tendency to say, he's going to carry that right into next year. And it's the other way around too, right? If a guy is a lesser second half than first half, that was his real season. That's what he really is. So, I think you have to be careful with that kind of stuff. And I thought that for a number of months, Farabee was not just putting up numbers, but doing consistently, right? He was rarely going back-to-back games without doing anything. He was one of the league leaders in scoring the first goal in a game. That's such a key part is to the team that scores first typically wins. Even league-wide, even teams that are at the bottom of the league have okay records when they score first. So, just a lot of those little indicators. I think Farabee is capable of putting that together for a whole season, and honestly, I think Morgan Frost is too. You look at he led the team in scoring the last 2/3 of 22-23, and was leading the team in scoring till there were about 12. From January 6th until there were about 10-12 games left in the season. That stretch when the Flyers swooned and everything fell apart. He was one of the guys who just kind of fell apart in that, at least production-wise, in that last part of the stretch of the season. But he put 3.5 months there where, again, he was leading the team in scoring during that stretch. So, it didn't end well for pretty much anybody. Really the team as a whole went the wrong way down the stretch. But young players still took steps forward in the bigger picture and need to continue doing that. In terms of setting expectations, it's both an expectation and a need for those guys and for the team to carry that on for a bigger chunk of the season and more consistently.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. Frost's first 48 games of the year, he had excellent. And then in the second half, it wasn't just that he wasn't scoring. He also was on the ice when a lot of goals were given up as well. And that certainly goes into that impression also. Bill, how much of this also, the feeling of walking on the treadmill but not getting anywhere, is the fact that other than innuendo, silly season rumors, and very limited conversation, we haven't really heard anything about Travis Konecny of real substance. We don't know if negotiations are happening. We've heard some numbers tossed around, and there's been some sticker shock, obviously, with those numbers. But can you go into the season with TK in his final year of the deal with unrestricted free agency less than now a calendar year away, or does something need to happen before the year so you know what you're doing? Because if you're going to trade him as a trade deadline, you're going to get far less because you're going to have A, far less teams involved, and B, it's a rental.
Yes. No, absolutely. I think it can go a little bit into the season, but once you get to December, January, that's really where you don't want to get to that point. That's where you're really in danger of getting a lesser traded return. It just drags on. Every press conference.
I would argue, Bill, maybe even it's training camp, by the end of training camp.
But by the end of camp, yeah. I mean, I've seen guys sign, after the start of the season, and it's even happened where well, the guy's a goner, and then it turns out he resigns shortly before July 1st. But I don't think the Flyers can afford that. I think they need to determine direction here, preferably before the season. If not before the season, pretty early into the season, and you have a decision made. When it's still a little more than a rental, it's pretty much a whole season or most of a season to assess the player. But yeah, that's something that needs to be decided. And listen, I mean, Pat Morris is a veteran agent. You know, he knows the game. He knows what he thinks his client can get. He set his price tag high, and he also knows that on his current contract that he's going into his last year of. Remember that he wasn't there at the start of camp. Now, that was a little different. He was a restricted free agent under no obligation.
And Provorov at the time.
Yeah, both guys. It was I think the first 2 days of camp, but that's all anybody talked about, right? That both guys are still unsigned, and you know every question, every press conference, but at least the first question at every press conference was, what's the status? Well, when are they signing? Yeah, and you just go back a couple of years, different stature, but with Claude Giroux, he was going into the last year of his deal. In his case, it became obvious pretty early into the season there wasn't going to be an extension, so it just became a countdown to when he was traded near the deadline, and trying to get more teams involved, and in that case it worked out great, even though he would only consider Florida. The Flyers got Tippett and a first-round pick out of it. It's now kicked down the can, kick the can one more year down the road, and will be a first-rounder next year. But I don't think the Flyers can afford a situation where Konecny goes inside. And honestly, that's to me one of the big question marks of the season is, when did this deal happen? When is a decision made as to whether you extend them? If you do extend them, how long does it go? How much term is involved? I think that the Flyers are willing to be a little bit creative with it. Maybe a deal where it's either higher cap hit and a shorter term.
You're thinking 3 times 10?
Maybe. I think that
and then he gets another kick at unrestricted free agency south of 30.
Yeah. Yeah, if 3, I was thinking maybe closer to 4 or 5 years, and then still 3 years of unrestricted free agency at the end, and then if it's a difference between, the shorter. I think the Flyers would go a little shorter term and higher cap it, because you're still on the front end of it in a rebuilding phase. He still is reasonably close to his prime, and the latter part of it maybe just starting to decline, and when you add up the difference in yearly salary and cap hit, he's making up a big part of it with a higher cap, shorter term. The flip side of that is, if his first priority is maximum security, more years, then he sacrifices someone on the cap hit, maybe a couple $1 million. I don't know, but there are different ways of getting the deal done. If both sides are really committed to that's their first, their first priority, then that's what you do. That's where I think it would end up. I would also think that even though it's been made pretty clear the Flyers want to sign him, and Konecny has said publicly, his priority is he wants to be here, he wants to stay. I think the Flyers have, at least internally, they wouldn't be doing themselves any favors if they didn't at least try to get a sense of what market value is right now, what it might be a month from now, or not a month from now, but a month, a month into the season, start of the season, that kind of thing. Because you want to have a sense of, okay, how much of a diminishing asset is it the longer we hold, how longer this goes on and we hold on. I don't have much doubt that it would be a diminishing return as we just discussed. So that to me is one of the things that is sitting here unresolved. Going on a month after was the first day you could sign him, because before July 1st it was all theoretical anyway. You couldn't actually sign the contract till July 1st. So we're about a month into that, and with each passing week, then it starts to be a little bit of a time crunch. Last thing to say, that a lot of times in hockey or other parts of life, you need that deadline pressure to actually get over the hump and get a deal.
I could never write a term paper if it was due in 2 weeks.
Yeah, same here.
If it was due tomorrow morning, I'd start tonight.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? The deadline spurs action. I think with TK too, I just don't think you want to go down that road of having the value diminish, because it'll present itself to the fans as indecisive.
Yeah.
Which brings me to my next topic, which is Scott Laughton. We got those rumors, not this past trade deadline, Bill, but the one prior that Chuck Fletcher ran, that the Flyers could have gotten a first-round pick in return for Scott Laughton. They obviously opted to keep him. He's still here. They signed Ryan Poehling to the extension in season this year that they did, and there is some redundancy in what each player brings to the table. Are you surprised that Laughton is still here? Because to me, I don't know if there was a first-round pick back then. I don't. I don't know that there was one this offseason. I tend to doubt that there was. I think that maybe that would have been something they would have done this offseason. But you look at whatever the return is. If a team's offering you a 3 and a Helge Grans, I'm probably not accepting that for Scott. Not probably. I'm not accepting that for Scott Laughton, because I think he brings too much in totality to the organization and the team, where I go, that is worth me doing. I would rather wait to the deadline on a player like him and see how that market develops, even though I talked to Danny Briere about this. Less teams would be involved, but I don't think there's a team in the league that couldn't fit his contract, and you could find a way to fit it with a year and the remainder of this season coming up and 1 year beyond that. It's not cumbersome in that way, and it's not just a rental. It's a kind of a kick and a half at the can with the player. So to me, that would be kind of the way I would approach Laughton this offseason. I think teams probably came in on him and came in on him low. I wouldn't have traded him for low. I'd rather see if I can drive market share and market value coming up at the deadline if I deem that, I'm in a position where I should do that.
Sure. And a couple of years ago, if there was a first-round pick offered, I have little doubt that it would have been a conditional first round, and that condition might have been all the way up to winning the cup. And only 16 teams are going to go in the playoffs, one's going to win. Completely out of your hands. And then all of a sudden, if you don't get that first round pick, then it becomes a late second round pick. And there comes a point where you take the second rounder or player or whatever. I don't think Laughton's at that point yet. I don't because look at the Flyers' penalty kill this past year. How big of a part of it was Laughton? He's had years more shorthanded goals, but you look at the shorthanded goals. How many did Laughton assist on? A lot of them. Yeah. Right. He was a big part of why the penalty kill was so much better this past season. He and Konecny were peas in a pod. They had such good chemistry on the PK that they were actually a threat to counterattack, a threat to create scoring chances, keep other teams on their heels. So even if the overall offensive numbers are just okay, not you call it top 6 guy necessarily in those regards, his combination of versatility, penalty killing, and the intangibles, the off-ice stuff, sets a pretty unique value where it's hard to evaluate him to what his exact trade point is, because there aren't a ton of players that offer as many things as he does. That's why there are so many teams that would have a level of interest in him. On the flip side, it gets to the point where you hold the asset forever and it becomes a diminishing asset. I think that in the short term, you can also be a little bit patient still. I know patience is an overused word, but I do think
that's funny because the tear it down people are the ones that are complaining about the lack of patience. But if you tear it down, it requires more patience.
It does, because it's going to take that much longer.
It's contradiction. Right? Yeah.
It's going to take that much longer.
Sometimes it can become endemic.
Yeah, and obviously the same thing with Konecny too. If you move Konecny and you get assets in return, no players as the main pieces, it's going to take that much longer. And guess what? There's still no guarantees you win the lottery and pick first or second.
Yeah.
And you can move down a few spots. You'll get a good player. There's a good draft this year, but there's no guarantees. Is the whole point. And you have to be able to come up with players pretty much wherever you're drafting. You and I have both discussed tanking before, and it's not just the draft pick that results from it. It's also the mentality that sets in. I never want players to be used to and expect to lose. That takes so many years to work your way through. I think that Buffalo still goes through that, even though they've added talent. They almost expect to fail. I mean, internally in the room, the people that matter the most, that they're so used to failing that it kind of makes it a self-fulfilling prophecy sometimes. I think so.
I think it's still a stain for Toronto too, Bill.
Yeah.
When Babcock came in and said there's going to be more pain. And they got all that top talent. They didn't build the team right because they just weighted too much to the forwards. But I think when you are fine with that result because of how it's going to yield you draft capital in the offseason, I think it's like a car mechanic that works on a car all day. You don't wash your hands once and it comes off. Yeah. And you can't just change the coach and he washes it off. Sometimes... And these are very important years when players are young, right? These are the foundational blocks of their competitiveness as professionals. They're very impressionable at that time. I think it's a very tenuous thing to put in. Yeah, there's some players that they can lose for the first 8 years of their career, but they're winners and they eventually win. But I think there's far less of those guys than we tend to think sometimes. I mean, I get why people are kind of like, well, what has this offseason been all about? I mean, when you look at it in total, Bill, with some expectations coming into it, no news on TK, as we just talked about. The extensions are Hathaway, which is a year early, on a role player. On Eric Johnson, who's finishing out the strings, not even going to be in the lineup, probably half the games this year. Bobby Brink, who had some moments this year that were decent, but got in the coach's doghouse, and we're kind of wondering where he's going to go this coming year. Zamula as well. And then you look at the Fedotov extension. Seems like an eternity ago, but that happened right after right when their offseason began at 3.25. People got a little taken back by the number of 6.5 total over 2 years. Then the drafting of Jet Lachenko and not Zeev Boehm, and the trading of pick 32. It's again a kick the can down the road. Not much subtraction from a team that missed the playoffs. Farabee, Frost, Laughton are all still here. Atkinson's gone, but it hasn't been it's been anticlimactic. It's been underwhelming as an offseason. Maybe that's the exact right thing to do. Living through the underwhelming part of not a lot of change, or it's not insignificant because it could end up being significant that it was insignificant, but this is the hard part, kind of living through that and getting into a lather. I mean, thank goodness, 39, Matvei Michkov's going to be coming over, I think he said, on August 20th.
Yeah, and no, for sure. And there's a concern, and it's a legitimate concern, that you're only going halfway in on a rebuild. It's kind of what Ron Hextall did, right? The Flyers stockpiled a lot of draft picks, put a lot of eggs in the basket of developing young players. I've posted this graphic before from the Hockey News, their Future Watch issue. 2018 Flyers were ranked second league-wide. The next year they were ranked first league-wide. And this is a poll of NHL scouting directors. But it didn't work out. Clearly it didn't work out. And what happened in the meantime was you never found that next group that was going to take over from the Giroux, the Voraceks, the Simmons.
Yeah.
And be your next group to lead. Those players went through their prime or on the downside, and so they started to disappear, and you never really replaced them. If you're not careful, the same thing could happen again, where you're drafting a number of guys who go on and play in the NHL, but they don't become the top dog. You need that next group to, and hopefully Michkov is that guy, but you still need that center, which you almost have to draft. It is so hard to trade for that guy or wait till he's a free agency age. You pretty much a number one defenseman or number one center. They're guys who, in most cases, you're going to have to find through the draft. And you can't sit and wait and count on a Patrice Bergeron, who was a second-round pick, a late second-round pick, but he went on to be a major star for a long time. That's luck. A Braden Point is largely luck.
Yeah.
You can't wait around and wait for luck. So I
don't
can
pin
understand.
your hopes on late second, third, and third round picks.
And every once in a while, you hit a home run and it's fantastic. But it's not a planning strategy. You need to find those players, and so I understand the thought process where the only way we're going to get those guys is at the top of the draft. So you have to be bad, whether you're out there tanking or trying your best, but you're just not good enough. It's two ways of looking at it, I guess. But I do think that in the long haul, the Flyers do need to add more talent. And sorry, the lights just blinked on off here during a thunderstorm. Anyway, the Flyers do need to add more talent, more top end guys, and the best way to do it is through the draft, through young players, through development, and taking some risks. And at some point, you're going to need to take risks. And I don't mean taking Luchenko at 13 when he might have gone 20th or 21st. That's not really a reach. That's just a little bit of a difference in internal ranking. I don't consider that really taking a big risk on somebody. There's going to come a point where I think the ultimate example from Flyers history was Mark Recchi. Was a star. He was an all-star. Back-to-back 100-point seasons. You traded into Montreal and you got Desjardins and you didn't know what you were really getting in Leclerc. You thought he was going to be a top 9 forward. It turned out he was a 50-goal scorer. But sometimes you have to take that risk where you're trading a guy you really don't want to trade, and you're kind of sticking your neck out, and it works out for you. Sometimes it doesn't. But there's going to come a point where you're going to have to take that kind of a risk, and if you're going to take that big jump, you have to take that risk, and it has to play out for you.
Yeah, there's you see those kind of trades littered all over organizations. You looked at the acquisition of Pronger and what the Flyers package that they sent to get him, and a lot of people looked at Pronger that side and said he's right at the end, like you can't. But you were close, and you ended up getting to a Game 6 of a final with Pronger, and then we know how things unfortunately ended for him, and he obviously had some really good hockey left. And then you got to find guys like Billy Leno, and you got to find role guys like Scott Hartnell and heart and soul guys, and couple those with it's a big equation to say the least. Well, Bill, we talked about a lot of the off-season expectations to this point, and I don't know that much is going to change, although we could see a contract extension for TK or trades at any time, but it's maybe less likely to happen now. Next week, we'll dip into the expectations of the season that is to come as currently constructed. So with that, we'll leave it there. Read Bill's work at PhiladelphiaFlyers.com, NHL.com, and HockeyBuzz.com, and we will catch you Wednesday on a brand new episode of Flyers Daily.